They hit Kyiv in the dark, missiles and drones, wave after wave, aimed at the heart of a capital city where 3 million people were sleeping. The explosions lit up the skyline. The air raid sirens had been screaming for 20 minutes before the first impact, and when the dust settled, when the fires were counted, when the damage reports started flowing into Ukrainian emergency services, Russia's military command sat back and waited for the response they had always gotten before: condemnation, grief, appeals to the international community, candlelight vigils, strongly worded statements from foreign ministries that would be forgotten by the following news cycle. That is not what they got. What they got was overnight. What they got was coordinated. What they got was so precisely targeted, so operationally devastating, and so strategically significant that by the time the sun rose over Moscow the following morning, Russian military commanders were looking at damage assessments that they had not war-gamed, had not prepared for, and could not immediately explain to the men above them in a chain of command that runs all the way up to one very uncomfortable man sitting in the Kremlin. Ukraine did not condemn. Ukraine did not grieve publicly. Ukraine did not reach for the microphone first. Ukraine reached for the target list, and what happened next changed the calculus of this war in ways that are still fully being understood by everyone, including Russia. Let's go back to the Kyiv strike itself, because the details of what Russia did matter enormously for understanding the scale of what Ukraine did in response. This was not a random attack. Russia's targeting of Kyiv is never random. Every mass strike on the Ukrainian capital is a political communication as much as a military operation, a message sent in the language of explosions and fire to multiple audiences simultaneously. To the Ukrainian population, you are not safe anywhere. To the Ukrainian government, your capital is not a sanctuary. To Western governments watching from Brussels and Washington and London, look what we can still do. Look how this war is still costing Ukraine in ways you cannot fully compensate for with weapons packages and financial support. The specific strike that preceded Ukraine's overnight revenge targeted civilian infrastructure in Kyiv with a combination of ballistic missiles and Shad drones deployed in a sequenced attack pattern designed to overwhelm air defense systems. The sequencing is deliberate and has been refined over 2 years of mass strike operations. Send the drones first to exhaust interceptor missiles and activate the full air defense network. Then follow with ballistic missiles moving faster than the response cycle can fully accommodate. Force the defenders to make impossible choices about what to prioritize. It is a sophisticated attack methodology. It is also stripped of all military language, a system designed to maximize the probability that something hits a city, where people live, where hospitals operate, where children sleep. The strike hit a residential district, a power substation serving 3 districts of the city, a water pumping station, infrastructure whose destruction does not kill soldiers, infrastructure whose destruction makes civilian life harder, colder, darker, more desperate. That is what Russia hit. That is what Russia chose to hit. Ukraine chose differently. Here is the specific moment where this story turns, not on a battlefield. In an intelligence operations room somewhere in Ukraine, the precise location classified to a degree that even Allied intelligence services are given only partial visibility, where a targeting committee had been sitting on a list of high-value Russian military infrastructure targets, waiting for exactly this kind of provocation, to provide the political authorization to deploy. The Ukrainian military does not improvise its deep strike operations. This is the thing that Western analysts consistently underestimate and Russian military planners have consistently overestimated in their favor. Every major Ukrainian strike into Russian territory or against Russian high-value targets is the product of weeks, sometimes months, of intelligence collection, target development, route planning, platform selection, and operational security management. The overnight response to the Kyiv attack was not assembled overnight. The intelligence was assembled overnight, the decision was made overnight, but the capability had been ready and waiting. In the specific way that professional military organizations prepare capabilities, ahead of the decision authority to use them so that when the authorization comes, the execution is immediate, and the execution was immediate. Multiple strike packages launched simultaneously from dispersed positions across Ukrainian territory. The vector diversity was itself a message, not all coming from the same direction, not all following the same approach corridor, not all presenting the same signature to Russian early warning and air. Defense systems, different altitudes, different speeds, different radar cross sections, the cumulative effect on Russian air defense network management, a distributed targeting problem that could not be solved by concentrating defensive resources at any single point. The targets Russia woke up to finding destroyed were not chosen for symbolic value. They were chosen for operational impact. And this distinction is the difference between a retaliation that makes a statement and a retaliation that changes the battlefield. A fuel storage facility in the Voronezh region, a primary node in the logistics chain supplying Russian forces on the northern axis of the Ukrainian front, not a pipeline, not a refinery far from the operational zone, a forward-positioned storage facility whose specific function was to reduce the distance between Russian fuel reserves and the tanks, aircraft, and vehicles consuming them in active combat operations. Destroying it does not just create a fire, it creates a gap in the supply throughput that has to be filled from facilities further back through longer and more vulnerable logistics lines at slower replenishment rates that the forward operational tempo cannot wait for. A military airfield in Rostov Oblast used for staging Russian strike aircraft conducting operations against Ukrainian territory, not a permanent Air Force base with deep redundancy and hardened infrastructure, a forward operating location whose specific value was its proximity to the front, the proximity that made it a highly efficient launch platform, and that also made it, once Ukraine's strike planners had it on their target list, an efficiently hittable target. 3 ammunition storage points along the logistics spine feeding Russian forces in the south. Ammunition storage is the single most irreplaceable logistics requirement in high-intensity artillery warfare. You can reroute fuel, you can airdrop food, you cannot improvise artillery ammunition when the shells run out, when a storage point burns and ammunition storage burns catastrophically in secondary explosions that continue for hours and can be seen from satellites. The loss is not just the physical shells, it is the planned resupply cycle for every unit that was drawing from that point. This is what Ukraine hit overnight, not symbols, not gestures, the specific physical infrastructure that makes Russian military operations function. Now the numbers, because the numbers are where the strategic reality lives and where the Russian Ministry of Defense's careful language goes to die, the combined assessment of damage. Across the overnight Ukrainian strike operation compiled from satellite imagery, open-source intelligence analysis, Ukrainian military official statements, and the inadvertent confirmations embedded in Russian emergency services responses points to infrastructure losses measurable in the billions of rubles, not the sanitized official Russian figures, the actual damage visible from orbit. The Voronezh fuel storage facility alone had a storage capacity estimated at several 100,000 metric tons of petroleum products fuel that had been pre-positioned specifically to support the operational tempo of Russian forces on the adjacent front axis. When a facility of that capacity burns, you do not replace it with a phone call. You replace it with months of engineering, construction, and security hardening, months during which the operational forces it was supposed to supply are drawing from reserves, from more distant facilities, from a degraded logistics baseline that constrains their options on the battlefield in real and measurable ways. The airfield strike took offline a launch platform that had been conducting an average of multiple strike sorties per day against Ukrainian territory. Each day that airfield is not operational is a day those sorties are not flown or are flown from more distant facilities with greater fuel consumption per sortie, reduced time on task, and increased wear on airframes operating at extended ranges. The mathematical reduction in Russian strike aviation capacity is not enormous taken alone. Added to every other simultaneous capacity degradation that Ukraine is imposing across the Russian military system, it is one more ratchet. Turn in an attrition campaign that compounds over weeks and months into strategic effect. The three ammunition storage points represent a combined loss that Russian logistics planners will be working to compensate for over weeks. Artillery units drawing from those points will experience ammunition rationing, reduced firing rates, prioritized allocation to the most critical frontline positions, suspension of the kind of sustained preparatory bombardment that Russian tactical doctrine requires before infantry and armor assaults. Less ammunition means fewer assaults. Fewer assaults means reduced offensive pressure. Reduced offensive pressure means Ukrainian defensive lines can be reinforced, rotated, and prepared for the next Russian push at a pace that the frontline situation would not otherwise allow. The overnight revenge ripples forward through time in ways that don't appear in the immediate damage assessment, but that frontline commanders will feel in the weeks ahead. Russia's official response to the strike arrived in the specific form it always takes when the damage is real and the embarrassment is acute: denial, then minimization, then reframing. The Russian Ministry of Defense acknowledged a Ukrainian provocation involving drone and missile strikes on Russian territory. It described the strikes as having been largely repelled by Russian air defense systems, with damage described as minimal and primarily affecting non-military infrastructure. Largely repelled, that is, the diplomatic language, let me translate that for you, largely repelled, when used by a military press office to describe an enemy strike operation, means we intercepted some of it. The part we did not intercept hit what it was aimed at and caused the damage you can see from space. Calling it largely repelled is mathematically defensible if you count by the number of incoming munitions rather than by the value of what was destroyed. It is the language of an institution that has decided that the audience it is managing, the Russian domestic public, does not have access to the satellite imagery, the open source analysis, or the cross-referenced logistics data that would allow them to evaluate the claim independently. It is a statement calibrated for people who cannot check it. And here is what makes that calculation increasingly precarious for the Kremlin. The number of Russian citizens who can check it is growing. Telegram channels aggregating open source intelligence about Russian territory strikes, relatives of soldiers at forward positions who are calling home and describing what the logistics situation actually looks like from the receiving end. Local officials instruct regions who are filing emergency reports that enter bureaucratic systems too large and too distributed for central information management to fully suppress. The gap between the official narrative and the lived experience of Russians in the affected regions is widening with every strike. Managing that gap is consuming political energy and institutional credibility that the Kremlin has finite reserves of. Let's talk about the psychological state of the men at the top of Russia's military command, because this is where the panic becomes visible, not in press releases, but in decisions. In the 72 hours following the Ukrainian overnight revenge operation, Russian military command made 3 decisions that individually look like tactical management, but collectively read as the behavioral signature of a command structure that has been genuinely destabilized. First, an immediate reallocation of air defense assets. Additional S-400 batteries were repositioned from relatively stable rear areas toward the regions hit by Ukrainian strikes. This sounds prudent. It is in isolation, but air defense systems are not infinitely divisible. Every battery moved to protect a newly threatened rear area logistics node is a battery no longer covering whatever position it was previously assigned to. The Russian air defense network is not large enough to be simultaneously present everywhere its commanders would like it to be. Robbing Peter to pay Paul moving coverage to compensate for the latest demonstrated vulnerability leaves new gaps that Ukrainian targeting analysts are already mapping. Second, an accelerated schedule for Russian mass strikes on Ukrainian territory, rather than the planned operational tempo. Russian strategic strike assets were committed to a higher frequency attack cycle in the days following the overnight revenge. This sounds aggressive. What it actually represents is the operational logic of a command that believes the best response to being hit effectively is to escalate striking the opponent, not because escalation solves the underlying problem, but because it provides a domestic narrative of action, of response, of Russian military power being exercised rather than absorbed. It is the decision-making pattern of leaders who are managing their public image as much as their military situation. Third, an emergency review of logistics security protocols across all Russian operational zones in Ukraine. Review in military bureaucratic language means we did not have adequate protocols, the strike has demonstrated. This, and we are now attempting to construct retroactively the security framework that should have existed before Ukraine demonstrated its absence. The review was ordered. The review will produce recommendations. The recommendations will eventually produce some enhanced security measures. In the interim, the vulnerabilities exposed by Ukraine's overnight strike continue to exist. That is 3 decisions in 72 hours, each resources and attention that would otherwise be directed at Russian offensive objectives. Each one a small victory for Ukrainian strategy, invisible in the headlines but accumulating in the operational ledger. Here is the dimension of this story that the coverage of individual strike events consistently fails to capture, the learning curve dimension. Ukraine's capacity to execute the kind of overnight, multi-target, geographically distributed revenge operation described here did not exist in the same form 18 months ago. It exists now because Ukraine has been running a systematic program of capability development, target intelligence accumulation, and strike system refinement that has produced qualitative improvements in deep strike effectiveness at a pace that has consistently outrun Russian defensive adaptation. Every Ukrainian strike operation generates data. Every route flown by a Ukrainian strike drone is a route that Ukrainian engineers and tacticians analyze for what it revealed about Russian air defense coverage patterns, response times, and geographic gaps. Every target hit generates battle damage assessment data that feeds into future targeting decisions. Every Russian defensive measure that successfully intercepted a Ukrainian strike generates intelligence about which defensive systems are effective against which Ukrainian platforms, intelligence that drives the next generation of platform design and attack profile. This is a learning organization executing iterative improvement at military speed against an opponent whose learning cycle runs through a command hierarchy that is structurally resistant to the rapid bottom-up feedback that learning requires. The overnight revenge operation was more effective than the operation Ukraine could have executed 6 months ago. The operation Ukraine executes 6 months from now will be more effective than the overnight revenge. Not dramatically, incrementally, relentlessly, in the way that genuine organizational learning compounds over time into capability gaps that eventually become impossible to close. There is a Western dimension to this story that belongs in the narrative, because it explains the specific character of Ukraine's retaliation. For most of the first 2 years of this war, Ukrainian deep strike capability was artificially constrained not by Ukrainian ambition or Ukrainian technology, but by Western political decisions about what weapons to supply and critically what conditions to attach to their use. Systems supplied by Western partners came with use restrictions. Don't hit Russian territory. Don't target infrastructure inside Russia with these specific weapons. Stay on the Ukrainian side of the international border with anything we provided. Those restrictions have been eroding, slowly, inconsistently, driven not by Western strategic clarity, but by the accumulated evidence that the escalation scenarios that justified the restrictions have not materialized at the predicted scale. Each time Ukraine has struck deeper into Russian territory, the red line crossing catastrophe that was supposed to follow has not arrived. Russia has responded with more of what Russia was already doing, and each non-catastrophic outcome has quietly adjusted Western risk assessments, not publicly, not with dramatic announcements, but in the internal calculations that actually drive weapons supply decisions. The overnight revenge operation combined Ukrainian domestically produced long-range drones platforms not subject to Western use restrictions with systems whose operational parameters have quietly expanded as Western restriction frameworks have been revised. The combination produced a strike depth and target set diversity that would not have been possible a year ago. This is what strategic escalation management actually looks like when it works. Not dramatic red lines, not public ultimatums, quiet, evidence-based recalibration by governments watching the actual outcomes of Ukrainian operations and adjusting their risk models accordingly. The map of what Ukraine is permitted to hit with Western-supplied weapons has expanded, not to the frontier of what Ukraine would want, but measurably, significantly further than it was. And that expansion is reflected in the overnight revenge that Moscow is now attempting to process. Let's close the loop on Kyiv, because the city that Russia hit, the city that prompted this entire chain of events, deserves more than a footnote in a story about the strategic effects of the retaliation. Kyiv is not just a capital city in the administrative sense. It is the psychological core of Ukrainian resistance, the city that didn't fall in 72 hours as Russia planned, the city whose president stayed when offered evacuation, the city that has absorbed 2 years of mass missile and drone attacks and continued to function, to rebuild, to assert its existence in the face of systematic Russian attempts to make it uninhabitable. Every Russian strike on Kyiv is aimed at something beyond the physical infrastructure it hits. It is aimed at the idea of Kyiv, at the symbolic weight of a capital city under attack, at the message that Ukrainian sovereignty is not real, that Ukrainian statehood is not permanent, that the project of an independent, westward-looking Ukraine can be reduced to rubble if Russia is patient enough and cruel enough. Ukraine's overnight revenge is, among other things, a response to that idea, not delivered in words, delivered in the specific, undeniable language of burning Russian military infrastructure visible from orbit. The message: you can hit our capital. We will hit your capacity to keep hitting our capital. Every missile you fire at Kyiv will cost you something you cannot easily replace. The exchange rate of this war, which you calculated in your favor, is being recalculated in real time by us on your territory. Here is where Russia sits as a result of this overnight exchange. Not a catastrophic military defeat, not a strategic collapse. Something more corrosive and, in the long run, more dangerous for Putin's war project than a single dramatic setback, a compounding deficit, a slow, relentless, mathematically grinding erosion of the margins that Russian military operations require to function at the tempo the front line demands, fuel throughput reduced, airstrike, sortie rates constrained, ammunition resupply cycles lengthened, air defense coverage gaps created by defensive reallocation, domestic political energy consumed by the management of information about what is happening on Russian territory, command attention diverted from offensive planning to defensive crisis management. None of these individually ends the war. Together, accumulated over weeks and months at the pace Ukraine is now imposing them, they represent a strategic bleed that Russian war finance and Russian military manpower can sustain for a period of time, but not an indefinite period, not forever. The mathematics have an endpoint. Russia hit Kyiv. Russia has been hitting Kyiv for 2 years. And for 2 years, the calculation was that hitting Kyiv was affordable, that the costs of the strikes were outweighed by the strategic and psychological pressure they imposed on Ukraine. Ukraine just changed the cost structure of that calculation overnight, literally. Overnight, every Russian decision-maker who had internalized the assumption that striking Ukrainian cities was cost-free, that the pain flowed one direction in this war, from Russian missiles to Ukrainian people, with no equivalent return, needs to update that assumption, because the return came. And it came to Russian military infrastructure, Russian logistics systems, Russian operational capacity, and it will come again. The overnight revenge was not the culmination of something. It was the demonstration of something, the demonstration that Ukraine has built a sustained, scalable, improving capacity to impose costs on Russian military power that do not diminish when Russia strikes harder at Ukrainian cities, that in fact intensify. Russia hit Kyiv. Ukraine hit back, and the next time Russia hits Kyiv, Ukraine will hit back again, harder, further, with platforms that have learned from every previous operation and strike packages that have been refined by every previous outcome. That is not a threat, that is a pattern, a documented, demonstrated, operationally validated pattern that has now been established with enough consistency that it must be incorporated into every future Russian military calculation. Putin ordered the strike on Kyiv. The men around him told him it would pressure Ukraine, weaken resolve, generate the kind of civilian suffering that eventually breaks the political will to keep fighting. Instead, it generated this devastating overnight revenge, this systematic destruction of Russian military infrastructure by a Ukrainian military that has decided in the clearest possible operational terms. That restraint is not a strategy. Russia hit Kyiv in the dark. Ukraine hit back in the dark. And when morning came, only one side was looking at ruins that changed the strategic equation. It wasn't Kyiv, comments popular posts from this blog one. Why most Americans will pay more taxes in 2026 and how to legally avoid it. January 29, 2026. Your paycheck is about to get smaller, not because of a pay cut, not because of inflation, but because of a tax bomb that's been ticking since 2017. And it's set to explode in exactly 341 days. If you earn between $50,000 and $400,000 a year, this affects you, and most people have no idea it's coming. In 2017, something changed in the tax code that gave millions of Americans a temporary break. The key word here is temporary. That break expires on December 31st, 2025. When the clock strikes midnight on New Year's Eve, your tax bill could jump by thousands of dollars, maybe even tens of thousands, depending on your income. But here's the thing, the people who know about this are already taking action, and by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what they're doing and how you can do it too. Let me paint you a picture. It's April 2027. You're sitting at your kitchen table, staring at your tax return, and something doesn't add up. You made. Ruffle. Read more 10. Why AI will eliminate entry-level jobs first. January 30th, 2026, the career ladder you were promised. It's being dismantled right now from the bottom up. And here's the uncomfortable truth nobody's telling you. AI isn't coming for the CEO's job. It's coming for yours. If you're starting your career or planning to, the ground beneath you is shifting faster than anyone wants to admit. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why entry-level positions are the first to go, and more importantly, what you can do about it before it's too late. Let's talk about the elimination that's already happening. The pattern is clear. Look at what's happening right now across industries, customer, service roles. ChatGapt and AI chatbots handle thousands of inquiries simultaneously. Junior copywriters. AI generates product descriptions, social media posts, and email campaigns in seconds. Data entry clerks. Automated systems extract, organize, and input information without breaks or errors. This isn't a read more 2, where Americans are moving after leaving California. The data is shocking. January 29, 2026. California just lost 75,000 residents in a single year. But here's what nobody's talking about. They're not scattering randomly across America. They're moving to 5 specific states, and the pattern reveals something massive about the future of this country. I analyzed the migration data, and what I found will change how you think about where Americans actually want to live. For decades, California was the promised land, the golden state where dreams came true and fortunes were made. But something fundamental has shifted. For the first time in over a century, more people are leaving California than moving in. And we're not talking about a few thousand people. We're talking about a mass exodus that rivals the Dust Bowl migration, except this time it's happening in reverse. The question everyone's asking is, where are they going? And more importantly, why those places? Because the data tells a story that politicians don't want you to hear. Let's read more, powered by Blogger. Theme images by Michael Elkin.